Welcome to the Daily Brain Podcast, where words open doors to new ideas, better conversations, and greater confidence. Here's today's key. The word is cognitive. It seems like it's everywhere these days. Cognitive skills, cognitive biases, cognitive science, even cognitive genomics. But what does cognitive actually mean? And why should we even care?
What's fascinating is that cognitive is really about understanding the process of knowing itself, how we as humans make sense of the world around us.
So we're talking about more than just thinking here.
Absolutely. It's much broader. Cognitive refers to all those mental activities that contribute to knowledge, thinking and reasoning, of course, but also remembering, learning language, even using our imagination.
So it's like the whole mental toolkit we use to process information, make decisions, and ultimately learn and understand things.
Exactly.
All right, that makes sense. But I feel like cognitive has become kind of a buzzword lately. You hear it everywhere, not just in classrooms.
You're right. It's definitely gone mainstream. Think about how people use it. You hear people talking about cognitive overload when they're bombarded with information, or cognitive decline when discussing aging and memory. It's become a part of how we talk about the human experience.
It's like it's moved beyond just being a technical term into our everyday conversations.
Exactly.
Speaking of everyday conversations, let's go back to the basics for a second. If someone asked me, what does cognitive mean, where would I even start?
We could always turn to a trusty dictionary. Merriam-Webster defines cognitive as of relating to being or involving conscious intellectual activities, such as thinking, reasoning, or remembering.
Okay, that's a solid starting point.
Yeah.
But how would you explain cognitive in, say, a conversation with a friend who's not a scientist or a psychologist?
I might say something like, cognitive basically refers to all the stuff your brain does to help you understand and interact with the world. It's how you think, learn, remember, and make sense of things.
That's a good way to put it. It's like cognitive is about those inner workings of our minds that we often take for granted.
Right. And I think that's why it's become such a popular term. People are increasingly interested in understanding how their minds work, especially in a world that's so complex and full of information.
That reminds me of those cognitive biases everyone's always talking about.
Yeah.
You know, those mental shortcuts our brains take that can sometimes lead us astray.
Exactly.
There's this great YouTube video I saw called 12 Cognitive Biases Explained that does a really good job of breaking down these biases and how they influence our decision-making.
That's a great resource. And understanding those biases is crucial.
Right.
Take the bandwagon effect, for example. This is the idea that we're more likely to believe or do something just because a lot of other people are doing it.
Oh, yeah. I've totally fallen for that one before. It's like that fear of missing out, right? If everyone's raving about a certain product or trend, you feel like you have to jump on board too.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be a powerful force, especially in today's world of social media and viral trends. Understanding the bandwagon effect can help us be more critical of what we see and hear and make decisions based on our own values and judgment rather than just blindly following the crowd.
That's a really good point. It's like we need to be aware of those cognitive biases so we can avoid falling prey to them.
Exactly. Another fascinating bias is the outcome bias, which is the tendency to judge a decision based on the outcome rather than the quality of the decision itself.
Oh, I've definitely done that too. You know, like when you make a risky investment that ends up paying off, you feel like a genius.
Yeah.
But if it had gone the other way, you'd probably be kicking yourself for making such a reckless move.
That's a perfect example. The outcome might be the same, but your judgment of the decision changes depending on whether it was successful or not.
So basically, we need to be careful not to let those past outcomes color our future judgments.
Exactly.
It seems like just having a vocabulary to talk about these things can help us be more aware of how our minds work and make better choices.
I completely agree.
Okay, so we've covered the basic definition of cognitive and how it's become a part of our everyday language, especially with all this talk about cognitive biases. But I'm curious to dive a bit deeper into the science of it all. Where does cognitive fit into fields like psychology and neuroscience? What's the big picture here?
Well, that's where the concept of cognitive development comes in. It's the idea that our cognitive abilities, our thinking, reasoning, problem-solving skills actually evolve and become more complex over time.
So you're saying we're not born with all our cognitive skills fully developed?
Not at all. There are some basic foundations we're born with, but a lot of our cognitive abilities are shaped by our experiences and interactions with the world as we grow.
That makes sense. It's like any other skill, right? You have to practice and learn to get better at it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about a child learning to speak. They start with babbling, imitating sounds, and gradually build up to forming words and sentences. That's a prime example of cognitive development in action.
It's incredible how much our brains develop in those early years. It makes you wonder, What kind of impact do those early experiences have on our cognitive development?
That's a crucial question, and one that researchers have been exploring for decades. We have some fascinating insights from the work of Harry Harlow, who conducted experiments with rhesus monkeys that really highlight the importance of early experiences for healthy, cognitive, and social development.
I've heard about Harlow's experiments. They were pretty groundbreaking, but also kind of controversial, right?
That's right. His work was groundbreaking in demonstrating the importance of early social bonds for development. But the methods he used to do so are considered unethical by today's standards. He separated infant monkeys from their mothers and raised them in isolation with only surrogate mothers made of wire or cloth.
Wow, that's pretty intense. What did he find?
Harlow discovered that the baby monkeys, even if their basic needs for food and shelter were met, suffered significant social and emotional problems later in life. They had trouble forming attachments, exhibited anxious and aggressive behaviors, and showed deficits in cognitive abilities compared to monkeys raised with their mothers.
That's really sad, but also incredibly revealing. It highlights just how important those early social bonds are for healthy development.
Absolutely. Harlow's work, while ethically questionable by today's standards, was pivotal in shaping our understanding of how early experiences influence not only social and emotional development, but also cognitive abilities. It underscores the importance of providing children with loving and supportive environments that allow them to form secure attachments and explore the world in a safe and stimulating way.
So those early years really do lay the foundation for our future cognitive abilities and overall well-being.
Exactly. It's fascinating, isn't it, how those formative years can have such a lasting impact on who we become. And it speaks to the idea that cognitive development isn't just about reaching a certain level of intelligence, it's about a continuous process of growth and adaptation.
Right, and it makes you wonder, what happens when things don't go smoothly with that development?
Unfortunately, cognitive impairment is a very real concern. We have some source material here that describes the many ways cognitive impairment can manifest, affecting a person's ability to think clearly, learn new information, remember things, and even make simple decisions.
So it's not just about memory loss, as many people think.
Not at all. Cognitive impairment can impact a wide range of mental processes, from language and attention to problem solving and judgment. It can make everyday tasks that most of us take for granted incredibly challenging. Imagine struggling to follow a recipe, balance your checkbook, or even remember where you parked your car.
That must be incredibly frustrating and scary for those experiencing it.
Absolutely. Cognitive impairment can have a profound impact on a person's quality of life, their independence, and their relationships with loved ones.
It really highlights how precious our cognitive health is.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, are there things we can do to protect our cognitive function as we age?
That's a great question, and one that researchers are actively exploring. There's growing evidence that lifestyle factors such as staying physically active, eating a healthy diet, engaging in mentally stimulating activities, and maintaining strong social connections can play a role in supporting cognitive health as we age.
So it's like taking a proactive approach to brain health, just like we do with our physical health.
Exactly. And it's never too early to start thinking about those things.
Okay, so we've talked about how our cognitive abilities develop and the challenges of cognitive impairment. But I want to circle back to those cognitive biases we were discussing earlier. They're fascinating, but also kind of alarming. Is there anything we can do to overcome these biases, or are we just stuck with them?
That's a key question. And while our brains may be predisposed to certain biases, we're not powerless against them. Neuroscientist David Eagleman, who has done some incredible work in this area, argues that we can actually reset our biases and expand our understanding of others.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the first step?
Eagleman emphasizes that the first step is awareness. We have to recognize that we all have biases. It's part of how our brains are wired. But once we acknowledge this, we can start to question our assumptions and be more mindful of how these biases might be influencing our thoughts and actions.
So instead of just reacting based on gut feelings, we need to pause and ask ourselves, is this based on actual information, or is my bias talking?
Exactly. It's about cultivating that critical thinking muscle and questioning those automatic responses.
All right, awareness is key. What else can we do?
Eagleman suggests learning about the tactics of dehumanization. This is how people justify prejudice and discrimination by portraying members of the outgroup as somehow less than human. Understanding these tactics can make us more resilient to their influence.
I've definitely seen this play out in history and current events. Propaganda often uses those tactics to stir up fear and hatred towards certain groups.
Precisely. One common tactic is what's called moral pollution, where you associate the outgroup with something disgusting or repulsive. This makes it easier to dismiss their perspectives and justify treating them poorly.
It's like those old stereotypes and harmful labels that get attached to certain groups. Once those labels stick, it's hard to see beyond them.
Right, but by understanding these tactics, we can become more discerning consumers of information. We can learn to recognize propaganda for what it is and avoid falling prey to its manipulative power.
So it's about arming ourselves with knowledge and critical thinking skills to combat those forces of prejudice and discrimination.
Exactly.
Okay, 2 strategies down. What's the third one Eagleman recommends?
He calls it entangling group membership, or complexifying your allegiances. It's essentially about finding common ground with people who might seem different from you on the surface.
That sounds a lot like the old adage, don't judge a book by its cover. Get to know people before making assumptions about them.
It's more than that, though. It's about actively seeking out those connections and building bridges across different laws. Eagleman argues that if you start by focusing on shared interests or values, it becomes harder to dismiss someone just because they belong to a different group.
So instead of emphasizing the things that divide us, like political affiliation or religious beliefs, we should look for those points of connection, like a shared love of music or a passion for hiking.
Exactly. He gives the example of meeting someone new and discovering you both love to play chess. You bond over that shared interest, and even if you later find out you disagree on other things, that initial connection makes it easier to have a respectful dialogue and see the other person's perspective.
That makes sense. It's like once you've established that common ground, it's harder to see the other person as just a stereotype or a member of the out-group. You start to recognize their individuality and humanity.
Right, and those shared experiences can help chip away at those artificial barriers that divide us.
Okay, this is starting to feel a bit more hopeful. It seems like while our brains might be naturally inclined towards bias, we're not destined to live in a world of prejudice and division.
I agree. By understanding how our minds work and being intentional about challenging our biases, we can create a more inclusive and compassionate world.
So we've talked about Harlow and those early social bonds being so critical.
Right.
But didn't Piaget have a theory about stages of development too?
You're exactly right. He did. He proposed the stage theory outlining how kids' thinking evolves, right? It goes from concrete to more abstract reasoning as they grow up.
Okay, so what are those stages? Like, how does it actually play out?
Well, he broke it down into 4 main stages. The first is sensorimotor. That's from birth to about 2 years old. And as you might guess, it's all about babies learning through their senses and actions, like they're constantly touching and grabbing and putting everything in their mouths.
So basically, tiny little scientists exploring their world. But how do they even start to understand that things exist even when they can't see them?
That's where object permanence comes in. It's a major milestone in this stage. At first, babies think something's gone if they can't see it. But eventually they get it, like in Peekaboo. They realize you're still there even when you're hiding.
That's fascinating. So it's like they're building this mental picture of the world, even though it's still pretty basic.
Exactly. And then you have the pre-operational stage. This is roughly between 2 and 7 years old. And now kids start using symbols and language. They love pretend play. A cardboard box becomes a castle. A stick turns into a magic wand.
Oh yeah, my niece is right in the middle of that stage. Everything's a game of make-believe.
Right. But they're still pretty egocentric at this point. They struggle to see things from another person's perspective.
Which explains why reasoning with a 4-year-old can be so tough.
Exactly. And then around 7 years old, they move into the concrete operational stage. Now they're becoming much more logical. They can understand concepts like conservation.
You mean like when you pour the same amount of liquid into different shaped glasses, they finally realize it's still the same amount?
Exactly. They get that just because something looks different doesn't mean it's changed. They're not fooled by appearances anymore.
So they're thinking more like little detectives.
Right. They can solve problems more systematically, but they still need concrete examples. Abstract thinking is still developing.
Got it. So when does that really kick in?
That's the formal operational stage, starting around 11 years old and going into adulthood. Now they can think abstractly, hypothetically, they can imagine different possibilities, and engage in more complex problem solving.
Wow. So it's like their brains are ready to tackle those bigger questions.
Exactly. They can start thinking about things like justice and morality, and their arguments become a lot more sophisticated too.
Piaget's theory is pretty amazing. It makes you realize just how much our thinking changes over time. But does it always happen exactly like that? Are there differences depending on like culture or individual experiences?
That's a great question, and researchers are definitely exploring those nuances. There's definitely evidence that cultural factors and individual experiences can influence how these stages unfold.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right, it's more of a guideline. Everyone's cognitive journey is unique.
Well, this deep dive into cognitive has been incredible. It's amazing to think about how much our understanding of the human mind has evolved.
It really is. We've come a long way from those early theories of development to current research on things like cognitive biases and the influence of our genes and experiences.
And it makes you wonder what the next big discoveries will be in this field. What are researchers focused on now?
Well, one of the most fascinating areas is consciousness. Like, how does our subjective experience of awareness actually happen? How do our brains create thoughts and feelings and that sense of self?
Those are some big questions.
They are, and there's so much we still don't know. But researchers are using brain imaging techniques to try to pinpoint the areas of the brain involved in consciousness.
It's mind-blowing to think about all those complex processes happening in our brains all the time.
It really is. And this research is even leading to exciting developments in artificial intelligence. Like, if we can understand how the human brain works, can we use that knowledge to create machines that can think and learn like we do?
AI is definitely a hot topic these days. Some people are excited about its potential, but others are concerned about the ethical implications.
You're right. It's important to consider both sides. As we develop more advanced AI systems, we need to make sure we're using them ethically and responsibly.
So scientific progress needs to go hand in hand with ethical considerations, especially in a field as impactful as cognitive science.
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered so much ground today, from defining cognitive to exploring its role in psychology, neuroscience, and even artificial intelligence.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. And I think it's clear that understanding how our minds work is incredibly important. It can help us make better decisions, challenge our assumptions, and create a more compassionate world.
I completely agree.
So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring the fascinating world of cognitive. Read books, listen to podcasts, have those thought-provoking conversations. The more we learn about how our minds work, the better we can navigate life and build a brighter future for everyone.
That's a great message.
And that's it for this deep dive into cognitive. Thanks for joining us on the Daily Brain podcast, where words open doors to new ideas, better conversations, and greater confidence.